Hello, welcome to this video for Comp 6259, Advanced Games Design at the University of Southampton. My name is Dave Millard and I'm one of the lecturers on the course. Now in these videos we're going to be having a look at procedural narrative generation. And if you think back to the videos we did on procedural content generation, you can see that narrative generation fits towards the top of this pyramid. In particular, it fits in the game scenario space, particularly as applied to story, but also has elements of world design and, as we'll see, things to do with news and broadcast. So in this first video we're going to be looking at narrative in games, just reminding ourselves what it is that we're trying to achieve with our procedural narrative generation. So a relatively naive definition of narrative would say that it's essentially a written account of connected events, a sequence that is told for entertainment. But narratologists have broken down narrative into multiple layers. At the bottom layer you have the fabula. This is essentially the things that happen in the story and the things that they happen to, the places, the people, the events, typically in a sort of chronological account. On top of that we have the story. So this is where we take those events, we select them, and then we organise them in a particular way for dramatic effect. And at the top level we have the narrative text, the way in which that story manifests. So for example, the same story might be told as a novel, it might be told as a film, or it might be told as a game. If we think about how these map across to the game space, well, the fabula, that's the premise of the game, the characters, all the world building elements. The story is the dramatic arc, and the narrative text becomes the game text itself, with all the rules about how we build mechanics and dynamics to make meaningful play. Now it's tempting to think that procedural content generation is all about the fabula, and narrative generation is all about the story. But the truth is that these two things are interleaved, and that sometimes a fabula will mean that a story has to be told in a particular way, and sometimes a story will make demands of the fabula, things that have to be there. So narrative generation is really about dealing with both of these things together, and about producing an effective dramatic arc. So what do we mean exactly by the dramatic arc? Well, there are multiple definitions. Todorov talked about equilibrium, the idea that a story is a set of a world or a set of people that are in equilibrium, then some disruption happens, the characters realise the disruption is happening, they work to restore order, and it returns you to a new equilibrium. The three-act structure, coming from Screenplay, Sid Field's account of how to do screenwriting, talks about the classic sort of three-act structure. So Act 1 would be setup, so you build things up. 2 is some kind of confrontation, and Act 3 is resolution. And you can see how this kind of maps onto Todorov's ideas as well. We kind of develop that into the classic dramatic arc, where we sort of plot intensity or tension or drama over time. And the classic dramatic arc essentially says that we have some point of exposition that leads to rising action, a climax, falling action, and then resolution. And again, you can see how this maps to the same kind of structure that's talked about by Todorov and Field. Now, a modern interpretation of this would be that rather than having a smooth curve, what we want to have is a series of events with sort of pauses between them to allow the audience or the reader or the viewer or the player to kind of draw breath and process what they've seen. So, for example, our story might start off with a significant piece of tension to grab the reader or grab the player and draw them in, and then we might have a series of events that leads to a climax. So one of the easiest ways to see this is through an example. So if you think about Star Wars, for example, it begins with a climactic scene in itself, right? The rebels are being captured, Princess Leia is running away with the plans. And then we go into, we have a kind of lull, we go back to Tatooine, we find the droids, we get Luke, we get Obi-Wan, all of that is set up, there's the real exposition for the story, and then we have our first point of action where Luke's parents are killed. Then we have a slower point where he meets Han Solo, and then a point of action again where they fly through the debris field and they find that Alderaan has been destroyed. Again, a lull during Luke's training, then the first scene with the Death Star, Obi-Wan's diversion, Obi-Wan's death and freeing Leia, back to the rebel base for our last pause before the final trench run and the climactic moment, use the Force, shoot those torpedoes down the exhaust port before we get to the resolution and the brief medal scene at the end. The challenge for creating a dramatic arc in a game is that the players have agency. they can make decisions that actually take you away from where the drama needs to go to create that structure. We call this the narrative paradox. So a nice example of this would be in Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. So Peter Rabbit is an adventurous bunny, and his mum tells him that he should, under no circumstances, go to Mr. McGregor's garden. But he goes anyway, and the book is essentially about the adventure that he has there. Now, if you hand that choice over to a player, they can choose not to go. And if that happens, it can destroy your entire story. Even if they make decisions that don't have that big impact, they can still disrupt the dramatic arc that you're trying to deal with. So you might want to say that actually in games we have this tension between story and play. But more accurately, it's a tension between drama and agency. We want to have a certain dramatic structure, but the players can choose to do other things. So when we think about types of narrative in games, all the approaches are essentially different ways of managing this tension. So in a design narrative, you have a human author that creates a structure, perhaps a tree structure or a network structure, that is then experienced by a player. Now, this is quite a tightly controlled structure, so that means that the human author can try and make sure that the dramatic structure is in place. But by doing so, they take control of a lot of the story, and that reduces the player's agency. In a design narrative, managing these levels of agency is therefore an important part of the design process. And you can go from a situation where you give the player full agency and they can explore completely. You can then begin to influence what they're doing by encouraging them using topology to encourage them down paths or down particular routes. You can give them partial agency by using things like quit time events or using the topology of the world to restrict where they go. Cliff edges that they can't climb, rivers or seas that they can't cross. You can use false agency to give them the illusion of choice. And of course you can take away agency completely. If you want Peter Rabbit to go to that garden, don't give the choice to the player. Put that choice in a cutscene and Peter will decide for them. A very common route is to use partial agency and manage it through patterns, and there are a number of very typical patterns that you see in games. It's very rare to have what's called a time cave, where every decision splits because you get exponential growth of your story. But something like a branch and bottleneck, where you make a decision, it has a local effect, and then it comes back together, is very common. Or something like a broomstick pattern, where you have a relatively linear story, but with a key decision at the end that splits into multiple endings. Another way of trying to reconcile drama and agency is to use the medium itself. So in films, often we tell people to show, don't tell. Put the information on the screen rather than a big exposition dump. And in games, it's do, don't show. So have the player actually do something. Use the mechanics to tell the story, mechanics as metaphor. Put choices in the game world, diegetic choices, and have coherent themes. If your story is about a certain thing, then that means that the graphics and the audio need to support that choice as well as the mechanics themselves. However, there are other types of narratives that we might use. In emergent narratives, there's no writer at all. Instead, the player experiences the world and then they perceive stories happening around them. Now, in this case, we get a lot of agency, there's a lot of freedom, but there's not much drama. And in emergent narrative design, what we're trying to do is to find ways of bringing more of a dramatic arc into what's going on. And in procedural narratives, we have a sort of a balanced approach. So here, there's an author, but it's a machine author, an automata, and it produces the story structure, which is experienced by the player. And a key difference to design narratives is that, unlike an author, the automata is there alongside the player as they play, which means it can observe what the player is doing and provide feedback and put that back into the story. So this is a really nice way of trying to balance both drama and agency together. So in the next two videos, we're going to have a look at emergent narratives and procedural narratives, and look at the design considerations that you need to incorporate in order to make them successful. Thanks for watching.